Everyone. My name is Jana Behrens. I'm the Director of Global Education at Amherst College. I'm joined today with my co-host, Emily Gorluski at Wesleyan University. And we have three fabulous panelists. We've got Malayka Serrano, who's the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at World Strides, which is a study abroad program provider. We have Amherst College student Eve de Muerto, who studied at SIT Ecuador. And we have a Wesleyan student, Rita Agarwal, who studied with the C semester program. So Emily, maybe you could just give us a little sketch for the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So we, again, my name is Emily Gorluski, and I'm the Director of Study Abroad at Wesleyan, and certainly have a lot of experiences of our students with this topic. So we only have 40 minutes today, so I think I'm counting 38 now to talk about race and racism on study away programs. So do understand that we are just going to scratch the surface of this. There are actually whole 4-day conferences every year on this very topic. So we're going to hear stories from our students from Amherst and Wesleyan about their experiences while studying away. And then we're going to hear from our equity and inclusion professional from a study abroad provider organization about their efforts to prepare students for their programs and support students through any incidents that might happen. So as I am not seeing Rhea at the moment, Jana, would you like to have Eve go
Absolutely. Yeah, so Eve, thank you again for coming. I'm so happy that you can be here. I think what you've shared with me, you've just had a very, very powerful and wonderful experience to share with prospective students that I think is unique and will be helpful as people really think about their time away. Eve is a student. You can talk a little bit about your major. I would love to you to share maybe, where you studied, what your major is, the type of program that you attended. And, it might be helpful to hear a little bit about the cohort, the students that you were studying with while you were in Ecuador.
Yeah, that sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name's Eve, or Evangelista, either one. But yeah, I'm a senior at Amherst College, and I'm majoring in political science and Spanish. I actually was a political science major first, and then ended up double majoring in Spanish because I kind of just kept taking it throughout my whole Amherst career and realized that I might as well major in it because of how much I kind of enjoyed my classes and time in those classes. So for my abroad experience, I went with an SIT program called Development, Politics, and Languages, SIT Ecuador. So I studied primarily in Quito, which is like the main city, but we got a chance through the program to do a lot of different trips to different parts of Ecuador. So I got a chance to, travel to like the Galapagos Islands, and we went to the Amazon rainforest. So it's a bunch of different trips within the program that made it really honestly secure for me, just in that planning it outside of the program was, trying to find someone to kind of facilitate that process and someone you trust and where do you stay. So I think SIT was great because it was really structured in terms of even the extracurricular activities that you could choose to be a part of or not. And then also super small compared to other study abroad programs. So I had 15 students in my cohort, which meant that honestly we got really close. Even if we weren't all best friends, I feel like traveling into a new place with that small of a group, you're bound to kind of form some intimate connections. But then I also really appreciated kind of the diversity among the students. So even in terms of geographic diversity, I think sometimes going to the types of schools we do, we meet a lot of kind of New Englanders and like East Coasters. So I really appreciated having a bunch of students from a lot of like bigger state schools and different, and like different parts of the country where our paths maybe wouldn't have crossed otherwise. So I think there was kind of an element of immersion, obviously studying abroad, but also just in terms of the dynamics within the cohort. And I feel like that's something I personally didn't really expect to have been such a crucial part of my time away.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eve. And Rhea is here now. So Rita Agarwal is our Wesleyan student who studied abroad. And Rhea, can you please introduce yourself and tell us some details about your really kind of unique program? Oh, you're muted, Rhea.
So sorry about that. I went to the semester program and I went in the summer of 2019. And semester is essentially like a sailing program, and you take 4 classes while on board. And
Hey, nice.
like that is not while also doing marine biology and oceanography. So that's really fun. And in my particular program, we sailed from Tahiti to Australia, and it was an 80-day voyage. And yeah, that was me. And I guess in particular, like about race and racism, which is what this panel, I guess, is focusing on, I was caught pretty off guard. Like everyone on the program was white, and I guess I hadn't thought about that like beforehand, before like going to the program, that sailing is a predominantly like white activity, and I hadn't like ever sailed before, so it was something that was that I was very new to. And am I frozen?
You're good.
Hello?
There, we can hear you, Riga.
Hello? Oh,
I'll type to her.
so that was something I was like, it was a surprise that everyone was white. And also I think like at Wesleyan, like I had an easy time transitioning to the States, because Wesleyan is like and like most liberal arts colleges, I think, is like a relatively like progressive and liberal place, but a lot of the people I was in the program with weren't like Wesleyan students, so that definitely like caught me off guard as well. Like I wasn't comfortable like expressing my queerness, or they casually like referred to me as like the diversity quota, and that was really uncomfortable. Just like whenever I tried to bring up like conversations around like race and privilege and why the cohort is like demographically structured the way it is, no one was willing or wanting to engage in that. So that was definitely hard, and I think something that caught me off guard. But all in all, like it was a great learning experience. I think I was definitely like, I'm glad I did it, and I learned so much from it. Like I think leaving that study abroad experience, I probably felt the most self-sufficient and the most accomplished I have ever felt. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, as Emily suggested earlier, that, you know, there's such a range of experiences on programs, and there's such a range of programs and program sizes. I think what's important to note with these two panelists, these student panelists, is that they both attended programs where group dynamics play a pretty significant role in the experience because they're smaller in nature. These aren't programs where you're doing direct enrollment at a large university where you have access to many, many more students. So that is something to think about as you're selecting a program, is the size of the group, and just know that group dynamics are going to play a bigger role on this type of program. So Eve, I wonder if you could talk now a little bit about your experiences in navigating microaggressions and stereotypes in the host environment. Thinking about homestay, your independent study project, when you were out and about town and traveling.
Yeah, so I went to Ecuador, like I said, and one of my main purposes is that I've been studying Spanish for a really long time. I feel like I established some sort of fluency, but I knew that kind of the ultimate test and growing point would be to really immerse myself in that culture. And so I knew I wanted to go somewhere in Latin America, and I chose Ecuador for a lot of reasons. It's just like really culturally rich. I felt like there was a large indigenous community, which is something I'm interested in kind of academically and politically and learning from. But basically there's a confluence of factors that had me choose Ecuador. But I think because of one of my motives for going was about language growth, I think that's why I personally selected a host family. I knew going into it that it would really honestly kind of go one of two ways. And that's just kind of the divide I've heard from other people who've had host family stays, especially if I choose, as I did, to stay in a host family for the entirety of my program, or I guess 90% of it. All that to say, surprisingly in Quito, which is the main city, there really weren't a lot of Afro-Ecuadorians, and there were a lot of African immigrants who sometimes are refugees, sometimes were just asylum seekers, sometimes were also just Africans living abroad. But I thought it was interesting because I felt like outside of my host family, that's definitely how I was perceived. There would be a really sharp contrast. And again, this is all happening in Spanish. So I think that that has to do with, I'm not sure if it's because it's a second language, but I feel like you kind of read body language and you read nonverbal signals a lot more because you're just kind of grasping at anything to establish that connection and relationship. But unfortunately, what that meant is definitely, catching some dirty looks or just, you can just feel when someone is kind of noticing your presence. And I'm very not Ecuadorian looking. I'm super tall, like I'm black, like I definitely stood out. But I think it was interesting also seeing the quick transition once I identified myself as an American. And I think that's a huge privilege that I knew but didn't recognize the extent of until that entire perception energy would change. And all of a sudden it was more of an interest. Whereas, but it was also just this kind of tension just in that my mother's an immigrant from Haiti, and a lot of Haitian immigrants happen to be in Ecuador, and there's a lot of discrimination that happens against them. So it was this feeling of, I almost sometimes was like, I'd almost rather be viewed as a Haitian because it feels a little more authentic to myself, but because I also wouldn't have to deal with this immense kind of change in perception just because of my Americanness. And I think for anyone who's kind of multicultural and going abroad, that's something to definitely consider. You're just read and placed differently than you might be in the context of the States, which was one thing I definitely noticed. But I think within my host family, I had an amazing experience. I know that that's not how it goes with everyone. I still talk to my host family to this day. We kind of send WhatsApp messages. I had just an incredible experience. All that to say, there were still those moments of just, I think honestly, a lot of the times I disguise them. I'm not gonna lie. I think especially in the beginning, my main thing was kind of establishing a relationship with my host family. It's a large reason why I felt like for me was going to be my biggest insight into language growth and cultural understanding, because these are not people who are part of the program. These are people who sign up to open their homes to kind of students from abroad. So I think sometimes it manifests differently. It's not necessarily outwards all the time, but for example, I had a conversation with one of my great aunts, sort of very much an extended family thing in Ecuador. It's not just like the immediate family who comes over. So I was having kind of a conversation with a great aunt who had come over, and we were talking a lot. She's very interested in my cultural background, again, because I was perceived, once they knew I was American, that was kind of it. So we were having kind of a conversation about that kind of thing. And you can just talk, even in talking about the politics of Ecuador, she made a lot of comments about, indigenous communities and how there's a huge uprising in October in Ecuador. And she made a lot of comments about how that she felt didn't need to happen. Or even she was talking about kind of the geographical placing of Afro-Ecuadorians in the country. They happen to kind of be centralized in two cities, Esmeraldas and Imbabura, which are two coastal cities of Ecuador. And that was something she, as insinuated that she appreciated, right? So it's not her outwardly saying, and she honestly, I think really did like me and made that clear. But I think those moments are sometimes tough to deal with in such an intimate space, because ultimately you're only a visitor. So although you're trying to establish these relationships, part of you is kind of I'm here for 3 months. I don't necessarily need them to we don't need to have a huge disagreement. But then there's also, you never want to kind of sacrifice your own comfortability, your own safety and kind of sense of self at the betterment of others. So I think it's a balance that I feel like I struck. And I think it's a balance a lot of my classmates struggled with, quite honestly, because of this this language barrier. I think I was someone who happened to have a bit more experience. So I was able to, one, form those authentic relationships, but also to kind of really understand the dynamics and intricacies of those conversations and what they were really saying and how that can sometimes be hurtful, which is sometimes just a disconnect that happened because of language for some of my classmates. So I'm someone who always advocates for host families. If you're someone who's really looking to be culturally immersed, in my opinion, it really can't happen without it. But I think as a woman of color, as a Black woman, there were just some experiences that I think maybe just moments I look back on and I know I wouldn't have necessarily let slide in the comfort of my own space. But for me, that's part of what it means to be immersive, and that could look different for everybody. But and this is again in the context of a family that's so loving, and I still talk to, and like literally like I have a Polaroid of like me and my host sister in the back of my phone. So it can happen even in these like amazing relationships, but people can't necessarily hide what they really think and feel about people who may look like me who are not me, if that makes sense.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. And Ria, I think that you talked a little bit, you had a very different experience. So can you tell us how you navigated microaggressions, stereotypes, etc. within your program cohort?
Mm-hmm. I think I tried a lot of like individual one-on-one conversations because like some people were definitely more receptive to those conversations than others. Like whenever I tried having those conversations in a larger group setting, I felt uncomfortable because I felt like I was a spokesperson for all people of color, which is not the case, and that felt like too much responsibility to carry, and two like I was dissuaded by some of my peers when I'd like bring up certain topics of conversation, and they'd be like, yeah, but have you thought about like this angle? And like that angle was completely sort of disregarding my point. Especially because like a lot of the countries we were visiting tended to have a lot of Indian populations, because a lot of Indians like were brought over as indentured labor, I think like a few centuries ago, like to those regions. So I thought that was really interesting how we were navigating the same route, and how again like most of the people on the ship were white, and like what that said about the history of like how that connected to like the history that like we're still living in our present day. And like whenever I try talking about that, like people would shoot me down. They're like, yeah, but it's like it doesn't really matter. Like we don't need to think about those things. Like they never, I guess like I had a hard time like talking to the group about like racial issues that were clear, or like just like privilege that we embodied in being able to do this program and in visiting the countries we were visiting, and in like even talking about like the violent histories of those countries, like who was brought over and by whom. But anyways, like I think I would try, like I tried having a lot of individual conversations. I made two friends who were all, one was from Wellesley, so she was pretty receptive to those conversations, and then another was just a good ear, like she was open to learn, like just having conversations. But I found that as a group it was a lot harder to like engage in that discourse. So I think my coping strategy was very much like forming individual connections, which would help like guide me and uphold me through those 2 months. And also like whenever we got Wi-Fi connection, I would always try to like call back home or call my friends from Wesleyan. So like at least I knew that, like again, like Eve said, like I was only in that like 3 months or so. So like knowing, like having those points of contact and like having time to talk to people who understood me and saw eye to eye was really helpful, because it reminded me that I was only going to be with these people for 3 months, and that it wasn't like my life. So it was fine to like live with them and deal with like just like small microaggressions. Yeah, but that was also like, I guess, my experience. Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if you could both take a brief moment and share, your advice for prospective students and kind of thinking about race and racism at home and abroad and on your program.
I think my advice would be, honestly, as a student of color, I feel like oftentimes, especially at the institutions we're at, we kind of unfortunately already deal with a lot of issues of race and racism in a way that's kind of routinized and daily, and may not be discreet to outsiders, but we know what we have to kind of endure to have gotten to this point and to exist in the spaces we do. So I think honestly, in choosing countries, consider kind of two things. That one, and it's a sad thing to say, but I also do feel like there's an empowerment in that we have already sustained up until this point kind of doing what we need to do in the classroom and outside of it, and kind of the environments that we're in. And so it never becomes less hurtful or uncomfortable, but I want people to kind of recognize that unfortunately it's something that exists everywhere. I don't think there is a country you could choose or a space you could choose, or even domestically, a place where you can choose where it may not happen. I feel like unfortunately, that's kind of what, it means to look the way we do, is that it's something that unfortunately exists everywhere. But on the other hand, I think the other thing I would advise people to really consider is also not to kind of let that, to consider that, and it's really important, but also not let that be your only factor, because it's something that's universal. I feel like for me, just think about like what you're really looking for in your abroad experience, whether that be language immersion, whether that be, I don't know, even food. Like Ecuador, when I was choosing Latin America, I saw like what, like, the traditional foods were of different places. Like there can be a lot of different factors that go into your decision, and I don't want people to only think about kind of the negative ways that their appearance may affect them, because unfortunately that's something that's universal, which is one to say, have your network, have your, established connections, so that when you're away and you're frustrated and you feel like lonely, you have people to reach out to, but also don't let that deter you from choosing somewhere. Because it's something that I think a lot of my friends have faced in places where I didn't necessarily expect it. And it just looks different.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. I would sort of echo that as well. I think the biggest thing for me was just like being aware of that, like before going, because that is something I didn't really consider heavily. I was so excited to go abroad that I didn't think about, I thought about the challenges, but I didn't consider like racism or like being in a white cohort to be one of them. So I think definitely being cognizant of that and like being aware of that. And I think what was really useful for me was talking to people back home and like having support structures while I was in the program. So I think like just like ensuring that you can like call back home when you need to, or like share certain experiences when you need to with people at home who understand you and understand where you come from, and like will have space to like listen to your experiences. Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing for me. And also like, I guess like while in the program, focus on what you're getting out of it rather than like focusing on like all the drawbacks, because like there are going to be drawbacks no matter where you go. And like I think especially being a person of color, like it's harder to navigate, but at the same time like keeping your eye on like why you're there, and also reminding yourself that you're only there for 3 months, and that makes it, I think, a lot easier like once you keep those things in mind and like move forward with that.
Great, thank you both. I could keep asking questions, but I know we have limited time. So we will have a period at the end to really have some Q&A, so those will come up again. But we are so lucky today to have Malayka Serrano with us. She is the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at World Strides, which is a large study abroad provider. They have programs all over the world. And she's here to really share how a program provider's perspective on race and racism, and really how they talk about race and racism within their company and their staff, but also with their students on site.
So Malayka, we have some questions for you. So keeping in mind that different providers do things differently, and neither of these programs was one that your company runs, can you share some examples of how a study abroad provider would address these types of issues? I saw you nodding a lot when the students were talking, so I imagine that you've had lots of experience with this.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Janet. But most of all, thank you, Eve, and thank you, Rhea. So my nodding, I had to mute myself. Like we like to say down here, the amen corner. I was actually reliving a lot of my own experiences as a woman of color when I studied abroad and when I taught abroad. In Australia and also in Venezuela. So each one of your stories that you lifted up, I can relate to on a very personal level. So as far as, the way in which we work, we really focus in on looking at inclusive pedagogy, which means that we take into account the social identities of both the advisors as well as our students, and understand that we all have a shared responsibility in creating really supportive learning environments. And then to that end, looking at identities, that really is central to our work. And what you heard from both of our panelists is conversations around visible or apparent identities, so maybe race or some other markers, but there are also a lot of other identities such as sexual orientation and gender identity, religion, and so forth, that also need to be named and lifted up and supported. And so that's what we do. I'll pause for a moment because I think, Emily, you might want to ask me about what we're doing in terms of working with our staff to get them up to speed.
Yes, in fact, you must be psychic. We do have a question about that. What types of training does your staff abroad receive about the racial climate in the U.S.?
Sure. We have to do the work. We have to do the work, and it starts at home. And to that end, what we've done is we've rolled out a series of online conversations or trainings for all of our staff across the world that we've done within a kind of a content management system, like we call it Schoology. And we've focused in on a couple of different components. So one is looking at race, ethnicity, how it presents in a US context, because they're going to be working with US students. We will also look at gender identity and sexual orientation. And then finally, we look at intersectionality, because folks of color, for example, are not a monolithic group. And so it's really important, to honor and celebrate all of those different pieces. But we are always learning. And so to that end, after rolling out sort of this company-wide training, what we've done is we've gone back and had it more kind of individualized conversations. And so, for example, in June, we had a series of conversations with our service learning coordinators, who are all based countries around the world, to do a deeper dive in unpacking their own social identities and also talking about it within the current context of what was happening in the US. So June 2020, I think I don't need to say anything else about that. But yeah, so continuing to do the work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's so important that staff be up to speed on students' needs and how things are going. So you heard the students' advice for students who are preparing to study abroad. What would your advice be?
So I would say plus 1,000 to the great advice that our student panelists have delivered. And then, in addition to that, just add a few more pieces. And this is mainly targeted towards the advisor community as well as faculty, program directors. And that is, first and foremost, we have to start the conversation. We have to start the conversation. We have to start becoming comfortable being uncomfortable. Doing the work ourselves. And so that also includes the unpacking of our own identities, and recognizing that we're going to be working with students who are coming from a whole host of different experiences. Agency. One of the things that I heard from both Rhea and Eve is agency and focusing on assets. And so to that end, one of the pieces that I want to lift up and celebrate for all of our students who are in the room today is that we are strong, and we have overcome tremendous adversity already. And so I think that it's really important to present information, to keep things 100, but also to recognize and celebrate that students have agency to make those decisions themselves. And so we want to empower them to be able to do so.
I wonder if I could add a follow-up to that. I think that World Strides is really invested in D&I work, and there's a VP, which is your role. I think there are a lot of smaller providers and programs that don't have somebody in your position to really think about diversity, inclusion, and equity at an institutional level and down. And so for students who are thinking about some of these smaller programs that maybe don't have that, do you have advice, either from your work and your profession or personal advice, about how to navigate that, and where's your landing page if you need to engage with the topic with your program?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I like to first start at home, meaning with the study away office or with the education abroad office, because oftentimes. And I know you all, you all are well versed in the space. And so one of the things that I want to encourage our students here is that even if your advisor or staff may or may not, at least initially, appear to have some similar dimensions of diversity, I would encourage you to still start the conversation because you'll be surprised. The second piece would be to ask to be connected with students who have studied abroad already. And so, you know, you and Emily, and I'm going to say April as well, are already modeling this beautifully by having peers and colleagues who've already kind of walked that path. And so even if you are going to a location that's different from someone else, I think it's still really important and valuable to have those conversations. And then the last piece is there's a lot of information available today. We have Diversity Abroad, we have the Forum on Education Abroad, as well as, gosh, countless bloggers and influencers, lots of resources that were not around when your friend here studied abroad back in the 90s.
Thank you. It is a different world, but you're right, those other resources that can help be a supportive voice, even if it's in an article, a blog, or something. Yeah, great.
Yeah, exactly. And allyship is everything. And that's one of the pieces I picked up, especially when Rhea, when you were speaking, is that you know, we can find these shared connections and support and our peeps, a team.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We really had some great stories today and some things to think about. We do have just a few minutes for any questions from anyone else in the audience, and you can feel free to...
And I turned her up and she turned me.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is it towards me, Miguel? Can you ladies hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for all the information that you've passed on to future scholars that want to study abroad. Very informative, and I feel like I got a good in-depth look at what I should be doing for the next few years. However, with myself being a person of color and the two panelists also being a person of color, this might sound like a double-edged question, but the first thing is, how do you deal with having to do all that work? Like, I'm a person of color and I don't feel like I should be the educator for people that cannot get past their biases or their prejudices. So my question is, how do you deal with the consistent and constant stress of having to educate people that are not as racially aware? And secondly is, as women, do you think that your experience was significantly diminished by the experiences that you had? And do you think that that experience would be different if it was a male cohort? Thank you.
Oh, do you mean a male cohort as in if I were also a male in a male cohort, or as a female being in a male cohort? Because
Well, I'm glad you asked that. What I mean is, like, okay, Rhea, you had an experience where you were a woman of color amongst a bunch of Caucasian people. Do you think your experience, that same exact experience that you had, would be completely different if you were a male?
No, I feel like I don't know how to answer that question. Like, yes, a lot of that experience was informed by me being a woman, but also like it was also just informed by me being a person of color. Like, I would have faced similar aggressions regardless of my gender. And I think maybe my gender like made it a little harder, because like especially with like sailing and just like manual handy stuff, like a lot of people assumed that I wasn't like capable, and it was really frustrating where I myself was like, I really want to prove that I can do this, but whenever I failed, I was like, oh no, now they're like, I'm sort of I am feeding into their beliefs and presumptions about me, which was frustrating. So it felt like internal pressure and external pressure as well. So I think that is definitely an extra challenge with being a woman, and also like navigating like safety abroad as a woman is a whole different thing than as a man of color. Like a lot of the ports we stopped at, like we get catcalled like all the time, and just like things like that. Like I think being a woman of color abroad is definitely like a whole different thing. but you still, like, I think as a person of color, regardless of your gender, face like similar microaggressions. I just feel like they're exacerbated when you're not a male.
Okay, thank you.
I feel like Ray pretty much answered the second part to your question in terms of your first question, in terms of like what kind of how to cope with that consistency and that frequency. Again, I know my experience is a little different just because there was this like I wasn't speaking in English. So I think it just honestly made it easier for me to just stop when I wanted to stop and put it on language or put it on some sort of, and sometimes I'd be upfront about it, but I think even body language would sometimes reveal that I kind of had reached my point, and I don't think it's good to always rely on that. And I was vocal about it when I wanted to be, but I think even sometimes when it wasn't even problematic questions, I think sometimes it can be hard to kind of feel like you're being questioned and questioned and questioned. And even if it's coming from a good place, sometimes you kind of feel a little bit like you're a spectacle. But again, I just don't think that's necessarily unique to my time in Ecuador, because I feel like when you go abroad, like you are the new and shiny kind of object. But my advice would honestly just be to take time for yourself. I'm someone who, even though I present kind of as an extrovert, I need time to just like, sometimes I would just connect my VPN and like watch an American show, or just like go on a walk or go on to a cafe. I think a lot of the same coping mechanisms I actually used at home, I think were really helpful, if not more so, when I was abroad, to just have those grounding moments to be like, I am not a representative of all Black people. I don't want to deal with these questions today, or, you know, whatever frustration it may be. And also just to explore where you're at too, because I think that's kind of the point, to find those, you know, random cafes that aren't necessarily tourist attractions. Those are the things that I honestly remember most from my abroad experience.
Thank you.
So we do have a question in the chat, which is, hey, how can someone who isn't a person of color or of a minority group help to challenge these questions of racism / sexism / phobias and everything? So we'll put that to our panelists.
So if it's okay, I'll just kind of hop in here. First of all, thank you for that great question. I think this really speaks to looking at active allyship, you know, and understanding who you are, as well as knowing that in being an active ally, one of the ways in which you can, I'll just say, kind of use your privilege for good, so to speak, is to be brave and to step up and to speak out in those moments. And one of the things that you heard from our panelists is that microaggressions, you know, it's been described as a death by 1,000 paper cuts. But the piece about microaggressions personally that really hurts me is not just that initial act, but it's also, once again, the slice of, okay, this just happened. The agony of, okay, what do I do next? And so if you happen to be in a space where you witness a microaggression occurring, I would encourage you, if it is safe, to lean in and to speak up.
I think just adding on to that, that's honestly the same thing I was going to say, but I think honestly what I always tell my kind of allies to really think about it is just that it takes a lot less out of you, even if it's just saying, I don't think that sounds right, or this is what's wrong with that. It takes so much less out of an ally than it does out of the person, right? Because there's not that emotional labor. It doesn't, or maybe there is, but it's just not the same extent. And also just always remember that honestly, just because we're people of color doesn't mean it's any less also just uncomfortable. You know, it's not just necessarily hurtful sometimes it's also just uncomfortable. So I think that dynamic everyone feels. So when you can kind of try to nip it in the bud, or, and again, I think sometimes people feel nervous because they feel like it has to be this like amazingly thought out like line of intervention. And sometimes honestly, even just diverting the attention to yourself is a relief for the people who may feel a little bit more uncomfortable. So just take that step, because again, like worst thing in scenario, maybe you're like a little embarrassed, or you're just like, I don't think I said that right, but worst case scenario, but you know, think about on the other side, kind of how much more it takes out of the person it's happening to, if that makes sense.
Really, really great advice, you guys. And we are at time. We do have one more question in the chat. Our students both went to non-European locations for their study abroad. Oh, Ria, do you have an answer for this?
I did do like a study abroad, but like I did 2 years of high school in Europe, in the Netherlands. And I guess I can take that question. It was definitely like Europe's definitely extremely white, and like I think puts up a farce of like liberalism and multiculturalism, but is like xenophobic and racist. And I think that's something that like catches everyone off guard. It definitely caught me off guard because the high school I was at was like extremely liberal and extremely international, which it was. But at the same time, the kids, like a lot of the Dutch kids were a little racist and like xenophobic in ways that they weren't ready to address. And like whenever disagreements came about, it was always like we were always shushed. Like it was like, okay, let's just like agree to disagree. And it's like, if we're agreeing to disagree, then like we're not having a conversation about your microaggressions or how you're like failing to recognize your privilege or how you're just like not educating yourself. So I think a lot of times like what like Europe like is so self-congratulatory with how liberal it is that they fail to like really address or like be receptive to any critiques of like the sort of environment you're in. And I think that is again something that caught me off guard, because like you expect Europe to like be this like amazing place of like liberalism, and it isn't. Like it's just as flawed as everywhere else.
Thank you so much, Ria, for that. And I am sorry that I didn't remember that about you. Ria is one of our study abroad ambassadors. So we've just been, talking a lot about things. And I think in Europe also, there is the cultural difference of people being a lot more direct sometimes and saying, just exactly what they think, more than necessarily we would always do in the United States. In the United States, we try to, I think, be a little bit more reserved about kind of sensitive topics like that. So I think that's another thing about Europe as well. And we are at our time. Does any of our panelists have anything else you'd like to get out there?
Just thank you for having us. Thanks so much. And feel free to, for sure, for a student perspective, reach out, because I think there's just so many questions, especially as you go further in the process, that come up. So we're definitely here as resources.
I just want to definitely shoot me an email if you have any questions or concerns.
A huge thank you to all our panelists. It really is so great to have you here and to speak from your heart. I really cannot thank you enough for doing that. So,
yay! Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you, also attendees.
Thank you all.
Okay.
There.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good one.
Thank you.